Muy buenos días a todos,
Good
bienvenidos.
morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Digital Autocracy, Maduro's Control over the Information Environment in Venezuela. My name is Diego Area. I'm the Associate Director for the Adrian Arce Latin American Center for the Atlantic Council. It is a pleasure for me today to be able to present this report and the results of this with the co-authors and our partners here at the Atlantic Council. This report is the result of more than 16 months of monitoring the information and digital space in Venezuela and its regional impacts. It is a joint project between the Digital Forensic Research Lab and the Adrian Arce Latin America Center of Atlantic Council, in conjunction with civil society organizations and some independent media who are with us today to share their analysis on the digital environment in Venezuela. When we began this project, the political reality globally was completely different in Venezuela, in the United States, and truly the entire world was completely different. The changes to the US administration, with all of the challenges that this transition has entailed for the presidency, COVID-19 obviously transformed the world. It continues to do so, and it will continue to do so, specifically in the digital sphere. And within Venezuela, we have seen a violent deterioration, an accelerated deterioration of living conditions, political polarization, and a few prospects for recovery in the short term. Today, we're analyzing this period with a lot of different information coming out of Venezuela, but also what we have seen throughout the region, with a focus on the tactics that the Maduro regime has used to promote information operations in the country, including its strategic partnerships with outside actors focused on disinformation. This manipulation of the Maduro government and the Venezuelan information environment is not used just as another social control mechanism within Venezuela, but also outwardly, it has allowed him to strengthen his partnerships with autocratic governments and promote narratives that are in line with his political projects. Our desire in presenting the findings of this report is to inform a strategy that joins civil society, governments, private institutions, multilateral institutions, and the international community to jointly combat the great challenge of disinformation that has become so globalized, specifically in this COVID-19 environment. Specifically, the US government plays a fundamental role. The need to revitalize support and take bipartisan action to support democracy in Venezuela. Now that we're in the fourth generation of this war, asymmetric conflicts, political instability, and uncertainty, we cannot underestimate the influence of these global information operations. The United States must play a leadership role in collaborating with international partners to combat this new phenomenon. So to talk about this, I have the great honor of introducing our keynote speaker today, former Congresswoman Debbie Mercosur-Powell. Former Congresswoman is a member of the Democratic Party, and she was a representative of the U.S. Congress representing the 26th District of Florida. And among her foreign policy priorities, former Congresswoman Mercosur-Powell fought for Venezuela to return to democracy through free and fair elections. She denounced the Maduro regime, and she has worked to facilitate the humanitarian assistance into Venezuela. Congresswoman, thank you very much for being with us and for your work for Venezuela. Thank you very much, Diego, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for the invitation to this very important discussion. As you know, Diego, this has been a personal matter for me. I have family in Venezuela. I've been in Venezuela many times. And unfortunately, what we have seen over the last few decades is a Venezuela that has transitioned from a stable democracy, which in a country that we saw as exemplary, where we saw democracy and a strong economy, but it has changed. Now we see a cruel dictatorship that is having a regional impact. I believe that at this time we are at a critical point, and now more than ever, it is incredibly important for the United States and throughout the entire region to really keep our eyes on the Venezuelan crisis, and that the international community continue to look for ways to alleviate the suffering of the Venezuelan people and to support a peaceful Venezuelan led political transition. The consequences of inaction on the Venezuelan crisis could be irreversible. We have seen this. The regional implications uh, can range from migration to there are millions of Venezuelans who have left into countries Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador. We also are seeing hemispheric security consequences, as well as the promotion of polarizing narratives. And during my time in Congress, as you mentioned, Diego, for me, this was one of my most important focuses. I condemned the violence that we have seen in Venezuela at the hands of the Maduro regime. We passed legislation to direct humanitarian aid to the Venezuelan people, because I have always said that Venezuelans cannot even defend themselves and they can't fight for democracy when they don't have access to food, to medical services. I also fought to obtain temporary protected status for Venezuelans. And under the Biden administration, this is going to become a reality. And looking ahead, with this administration and this Congress, we must continue to apply this pressure to keep the highlight on these issues, because this is not just a crisis for Latin America, but also for the United States. Today, I know that we're going to be discussing one of the primary tactics of Maduro's regime for him consolidating his power, and that is information operations. What Maduro is doing now is to ensure his survival and to continue generating mechanisms of internal control and influence. He, at this time, is maintaining tight control over the Venezuelan information environment against the Venezuelan people. The regime's disinformation operations have not just domestic, but also global implications. And in coordination with external actors like Russia, Cuba, Iran, Maduro is attempting to distort reality as well as push his narratives to promote his own geopolitical objectives. The report that we're going to be discussing today will help raise awareness of the importance in the hemisphere of continuing to expose these operations, building alliances with the private sector, multilateral organizations, Venezuelans in the diaspora, as well as Venezuelans inside Venezuela, to combat this disinformation together. Now is the time to join forces with civil society, governments, because we cannot do this unilaterally here in the United States. We must work with our partner governments in Europe and in Latin America. We must work together also with private enterprise and multilateral institutions to be able to combat this challenge of disinformation, which has only increased during this coronavirus pandemic and is very dangerous for the health of many Venezuelans. Again, many thanks to the Atlantic Council for bringing this very important topic up. It's so important for me, and this really is jeopardizing democracy, not just in Latin America, but also here in the United States. Thank you for your efforts in this area, and Diego, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Congresswoman. I want to go back to something that you said, that this is a multidimensional crisis, which will require a multilateral response, specifically in leadership with the United States that has a bipartisan approach to continue finding a way to return to democracy in Venezuela. You have said this before, and we thank you for this. We need to continue working to diminish the suffering in Venezuela, because they are the victims. Thank you very much, and it is an honor to have you with us today. Before I introduce the other panelists today, I would like to say two things. First of all, to our audience who are connecting in with us today, please ask your questions through the Zoom chat. The questions can be for any of our panelists, and you can also do it through Twitter using the hashtag #AlertaVenezuela. Additionally, you have and here in the Zoom chat, you have a direct link to the report that you can start looking through immediately. So I want to begin introducing Professor Carmen Beatriz Fernandez. She is a professor at the University of Navarra and CEO of Data Strategia, which provides political digital analysis. And she is a key partner for this initiative for Alerta Venezuela. Adrian Gonzalez, he's a director of Cazadores de Fake News, and he studies WhatsApp chains as in Venezuela and how disinformation works through this. He's doing a wonderful work. Then we also have Maria Virginia Fernandez. She's the executive director of Provox, which is an organization that combats digital disinformation. She's been vital for this project over the last 16 months, studying this alert to Venezuela. And lastly, Daniel Suarez Perez, who is the research assistant for Latin America at the Digital Forensic Research Lab, and he is a co-author of the report that we are presenting today, Digital Autocracy, Maduro's Control over the Information Environment in Venezuela. Danielle, we'll start with you so that you can introduce us to this topic. Welcome. Please talk to us about digital autocracy. What does this mean, and how has Maduro used information in Venezuela?
Estás en mute.
Danielle is on mute. Thank you, Diego. I also wanted to provide some context as to how we worked on this report with our Latin American team. It was 16 months of monitoring that began in 2019 through February, March of this year. And what we were able to see is this political crisis that is starting in 2019, and all throughout 2020, and what happened and continues to happen in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. What we explored is that there are different groups in Venezuela. We have the Maduro regime, a diverse opposition as well, who are trying to work in this both internal and global communication network with a specific emphasis on Latin America and in the United States as well. But there is a regime through traditional media, and we can describe this a little bit more in detail later, but we're seeing how this has moved into Twitter specifically, where the regime has almost all of the control. They can take over the media. For example, Guaido in Venezuela throughout this year, he was fighting for the presidency, if you will. There was Guaido and Maduro both exercising as presidents, but we had the Maduro regime who was really controlling the conversation through its influence and its manipulation. It bears noting that how Maduro's regime uses Twitter, paying with state resources through state bonds to take over this machinery, using groups of citizens to take over the Twitter sphere. And he was using these people, these citizens, to strengthen his own system. We highlight this in our report, and it didn't begin with Maduro. It began with Chavez, but he took it over, and he has certainly strengthened this system. So, as part of this strategy that we studied with Maria Virginia, and she can talk about this more in depth because this is something that she works on a daily basis, we can see how inauthentic this process is. And we're also seeing it spread to other countries, but it's been very successful for them. These users who are people, they're actually people, which makes it harder for these platforms to be able to purge them from the system or kick them off the platform through automated systems. And so now we're not just talking about machines and trolls. We're talking about accounts that are that are actually people. And so it may seem like so it's easy for them to get past the monitors.
And this affects the communications, which are their Twitter users, and you see trends. They're supporting the Maduro regime. So it's not this conversation from X time on X day. That's what's happening in Venezuela. That's a general snapshot of what we're seeing in Venezuela and what we've seen over the course of this past year. And then, yeah, in a country that is undergoing a complex humanitarian crisis, there's no work, people are having trouble getting food, there are huge malnutrition problems with children. So they're using these mechanisms that are working on the ground, like the clap boxes, etc., to push their narrative and their position in social networks. So the platforms are unable to block them or can't curb this because, as you were saying, these are people with names, surnames, who are simply promoting and pushing the same message over and over. They position themselves and they're able to master the narrative, master the discourse. So, in a pandemic where people have to remain home and the only source of information is digital information, so Venezuelans, most of them have a difficult time getting balanced information. And now I'm going to move on to Maria Virginia. So are these actions able to cloud the information or twist it? Maria Virginia, you've done really important work measuring and tracking these trends and how they work. Could you tell us a little bit about how this operation functions? Yes, Diego, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for the excellent work that DFR Lab has done looking at Venezuela, the region, and internally. Just to begin talking about how this affects the regime is affecting information, it's important to look at the context that you were talking about it. So since 1999, the Association of Journalists, more than 190 media outlets have been closed down between the Chavez and Maduro regimes. There's no newsprint. And so everything is limited to the digital space. So that's become a forum for information for Venezuelans. It's also for complaints and asserting their rights. On top of that, there are at least 5 million Venezuelans who are now outside of Venezuela, where the only way that they can find out what's going on in the country is through social networks. So how Twitter works in Venezuela normally. In March, we had 211 different political and social trends in Venezuela, approximately 28 million tweets. The official party generated 27 million of those 28.5 million. So the vast majority. So there's no other actor out there in terms of volume of tweets who is able to counter the official discourse. Say this is about 95% of tweets in terms of the social and political conversation in Venezuela. The rest of the actors, at least in the month of March specifically, accounted for less than 5%. So this is very serious. Beyond this censorship that comes through these automated accounts and people who are actually paid to push regime propaganda, there are also some specific elements that affect us all. One example is the situation of a medication that Maduro announced in January of 2021. The regime is publicizing this, as a medication that fights COVID, and the Ministry of Communication and Information of the regime, the day that this medication was announced, they positioned Carbativir para vivir, Carbativir to live. Carbativir is the name of the medication. And so it talks about the active ingredient in it. And so they are trying to create this reality that Carbativir is a medication that saves lives, while the WHO has refuted all of the methodologies and the studies that the regime is using to back this up. So that has not been approved by any international organization or regulatory agency. So this is a case where the regime's disinformation could even impact the very lives of people who follow them. Yes, this is like a leviathan that controls everything on the inside by force. But here's yet another facet, an important dimension that they have been building over the course of decades, this apparatus of propaganda. And it's not just in Venezuela. I think the professor, Carmen Beatriz Fernandez, will talk about this. We could talk about the regional and potentially global impact. So before we get to Professor Fernandez, I want to talk to Adrian Gonzalez, who is the director of Cazadores de Fake News, which is fake news hunters in English. And I have myself been following that and have learned quite a bit. Marivide from Provox and Daniel have talked a little bit more about Twitter in the context, but you all focus a lot on WhatsApp and other platforms. So could you discuss this in Venezuela? Yes, first, thank you very much, Diego, for this opportunity. I also wanted to commend the work by DFR Lab, this report that was just put out today. I think this is a really important contribution to the discussion on disinformation. As far as what we know about the dynamics in place to disseminate disinformation in Venezuela, Twitter is the most significant social network because it has the most complex ability to amplify message. We, however, have been examining that information and a lot of the rumors that are shared on Instagram, Facebook, as well as WhatsApp and some of the instant messaging features. Not all disinformation from Venezuela comes through tweets. Generally speaking, what we see is that is a communication space or of disinformation or rumor on Instagram, and then it eventually gets to other social networks and ultimately to WhatsApp. In other cases, you see that a WhatsApp chain will start to run, and we've been seeing how this will ultimately be posted on Facebook or text, or people will be discussing the same rumor over Twitter. The analysis of WhatsApp and other social networks is important to this discussion because, as Mariví was saying, there is a propaganda apparatus in place on Twitter. It's very complex, it's well developed. Much of the information that's spread in Venezuela doesn't come from Twitter or that massive apparatus, but it's from other accounts on other social networks. For example, Instagram, we've detected a network of accounts that spread news over Instagram, but it's coordinated disinformation in some cases. And very often it jumps from Instagram, these rumors then move to other social networks and end up on WhatsApp. So each of the social networks has its own specific characteristics. WhatsApp, I think it's quite difficult to study. We're trying to study disinformation that circulates through WhatsApp. We see that it's ultimately taken from other social networks and then ends up. So there are techniques and tactics and social networks to detect where a rumor has begun and the potential intent of that rumor. Thank you, Adrian. I think what's important to highlight here, and we can talk about this later with Daniela and Maria Virginia, it's not just the regime that's pushing this information. There are other actors that are constantly trying to dominate the flow of information because they're trying to push this narrative or promote some sort of idea. We've seen different examples of how private enterprises take hold of this disinformation and push it as well in an effort to make money. I will later ask a follow-up question to you, but first I'd like to move on to Professor. Professor, welcome. I love to have these kinds of discussions with you. And just a few months ago, at the outset of the pandemic, we were looking at how disinformation was impacting the pandemic and the way it was unfolding so quickly. We had an event, presented a report. You were one of the co-authors of that report that looked at perception inside Venezuela, Venezuelans. Who are Venezuelans listening to, who are themselves victims of the very situation in which they live? So could you help us understand the communications tactics, to promote socialist, anti-neoliberal, anti-imperialist visions? What points of reference do Venezuelans have? Who are they listening to? Where are they getting their news? Yeah, thank you very much, Diego. This is a very interesting event, and that report is extraordinary. Those who spoke before me, I would like to commend you on the work on this report. It's very comprehensive, and it's also quite easy to read. Your question is very complex because Chavismo never was able to fully control communications in Venezuela. Nevertheless, when they were ultimately able to mostly control communication, we started to see them as a minority in society. That was 2003. That's what they did, despite the fact that the Maduro regime has like an oligarchy over the media. This is something Marty V was saying, that they control the media that remain because so many traditional media outlets have been shut down over the years. But you see the narrative that they're trying to impose, and it doesn't lead to consensus in society, nor is it credible. On the contrary, the messages coming from senior levels of government, serious credibility problems, and the information or the disinformation has undermined credibility. And that is a scarce resource right now. Now, in the study that we did with the University of Navarra and with Transparency International, the Venezuelan chapter of that, we discovered some very interesting things. One of those was there is a pattern of information consumption that's very different among those who support the Maduro regime. And the clear minority, very significant one in terms of the power they yield, and 15% of the population based on our measurements. But those who support the official regime get their news from TV, while the opposition tends to get their information through social networks. And that's why the regime, in their aspiration to control the narrative and the importance that they give to social networks, even though, as I was stating before, they lack the necessary credibility to issue messages on social networks, which have an impact on the building of their narratives, but it does have an impact on the agenda.
It can also have an impact on moving this population, not just in the on managing the digital media messages, but as well as getting messages out, but also really poisoning the platforms with messages that perhaps are not directly related to the messaging that they're wanting to get out, but this could really be just diverting attention, which is a phenomenon that we are seeing as well. To a certain degree, the digital platforms or the digital space really does have this a bias confirmation, really. And what I see is how certain media are, or how I use certain media to not really inform myself, but really to confirm my own biases. And this is something that we see in the 2016 as well as the 2020 elections. But in Venezuela, this exists for various reasons. We have this bias confirmation, which makes people look for information just to reinforce our own arguments. So in this way, we can say that information consumption really just reflects the polarization that exists in the country. What you just said is so important, and I want to highlight this because I think this is really key. Firstly, what is happening in Venezuela is multifaceted. There are many different legs to this chair, and I think that it's really important for us to look at all of these elements. But the fact that you mentioned that the majority of the people who support Maduro are not using digital media, but rather traditional media, which are clearly pro-regime. But you've also noted that there is an intention or an intent to really promote mistrust, to erode trust in the opposition, polarize the community, and create dichotomies within the arguments, and really to just try to continue promoting the fragmentation of the Venezuelan society so that they can continue to maintain their power and their influence. And then secondly, this issue of diverting attention from the real issue, really, the mismanagement of the government, criminal organizations, and which the news would organically cover, but they are able to really divert attention. And I'm trying to divert people away from it because there's a lot of competition. People have short attention span. And then lastly, both in the United States and as well as in Venezuela, the concept of this bias confirmation, what social media does for us is to give us a toolbox, but specifically people, to find people who look like us, who think like us, who share our same prejudices, so that we can continue to act the way that we do. And that really just leads us to the danger of continuing to promote polarization, which is a big challenge, not just in Venezuela and the United States, but also Latin America in general. I wanted to ask our co-author, we know that we have a problem, Danielle. There's a very big challenge, and we need to really focus on our attention on this. But what ideas or what mechanisms do we have to combat this phenomenon, for people to be able to get better information and to protect people from this imposition of narratives? Hi, Diego. I just wanted to add in a parenthesis here because there's a lot of questions and some really interesting questions in the chat. Going back to your question, though, this is important because the key point here is education. In Venezuela, we have to look at the context, and that is people's access to internet. And Venezuelans within Venezuela have to overcome barriers to access to the internet. There was a very interesting report from NetBlocks about this Advance Sin Filtro that analyzed these barriers to access, and if it was one of Guaido's speeches or a specific event that the opposition wanted to share. For example, there are a lot of initiatives where people can start to educate themselves. We have Maria V, Adrian from Cazadores, and we have Provox, and different studies and analyses that Professor Carmen Beatriz shared with us. There are other initiatives and independent media outlets that are doing really important work there despite the difficult conditions. Basically, it's about counteracting disinformation. The same work that we're doing from the DFR lab that help to combat this. We also have a question from Yaided, how we can control disinformation that's coming from outside. But again, the key point here is education. We also need support through different initiatives and alternatives. But this is the day-to-day work that those of us who are working in this sphere, this is what we do every day. We are looking at how we can combat disinformation and this manipulation and the influence. It's great to be able to choose between different media sources, but in Venezuela, it's very difficult. Right, it's education, having options and alternatives to inform yourself. In terms of the next steps to follow, for those of us that are listening to us and they want to know how they can combat this with their families and their follow Cazadores de Fake News and Provox, Professor Carmen Beatriz, FLR Lab, follow independent organizations, civil society organizations, and media who are really starting to gain ground, and they're starting to build partnerships around this matter. Since this is such a multidimensional crisis, and there are a lot of priorities in Venezuela, right? It's a very complex situation, but just because it's so complex doesn't mean that we should abandon this space because there's so much, so many possibilities in recovering democracy in Venezuela. But again, Maria Virginia, we know that the only player is not just Maduro or independent media. There are other people who are doing it. Specifically, a few months ago, or over these last 16 months, rather, there are a few players who have been promoting military intervention from the United States into Venezuela and really been pressuring for this. And those are also sources of disinformation. Talk to me about what you've seen in that area. Right, just adding onto what you've been talking about with civil society organizations, I think it's very important to note that what we studied over the last 2 years is that the only actor that has been digitally confronting the regime's narrative is the civil society through social protests. They never get the number of tweets that the digital official party machinery is able to produce. But one time they were able to get the number of hashtags that were positioned to combat the regime. So really, we're focusing on positioning messaging that is rewarded by Twitter. So we can't underestimate these efforts. I have a friend, I think, who is joining us today. This is David versus Goliath. They have years working on their strategy with the support from Russia, China, Iran, etc. And we're up against something huge, which means we need to be united, and we cannot underestimate or rule out any strategy. So through what we saw with the elections in the United States, this was a very important event for Venezuela also. And in the digital sphere, we saw people who were really pushing trends, specifically in favor of former President Trump. One of the trends that we saw, they were called the Guerreros del Teclado, the keyboard warriors, because they said that Trump was, or rather half of their content was focused on Trump and intervention. And in the days before the election, they had a huge increase in activity, because saying that Trump was going to guarantee freedom and really pushing for Trump to win the Venezuelan vote. And so this type of movement really leads to more disinformation winning, and then more confusion as well. One of the other things that we saw out of these groups is that they also pushed information against the interim government and the opposition. For example, we saw how they positioned they said that the consultation, or the popular consultation that was pushed by Juan Guaido in December, was just a joke. And what these types of messages do is just reinforce narratives that polarize and push against real information, and really pushes people to the extremes and not in the middle where most people are. It's really important to talk about this context. The only actor who has really been able to effectively win a battle against all of this apparatus is civil society, and it's very important to have this discussion. We talk a lot about the role of civil society and the interim government in building a united front against the regime. And I think that social media are a reflection of the opportunities that exist to continue joining the message of civil society with the political sphere in Venezuela. And I think that this is going to really give strength to messages, because finally we're starting to see the results of an organic movement for democracy because of this united front. I think that this is interesting to see. I think it's indicative of where we're going. You also noted that this is not just something that is specific to Venezuelans or operations that are coming out of Venezuela. Before I pass the floor to Adrian, I wanted to ask Professor Carmen Beatriz about something that has been studied. We've talked about it in DFR Lab with Provox, and that is the role of outside or foreign actors in promoting regional narratives, the role of Cuba, Iran, Russia. Professor, could you talk to us about what your evaluation is, what we can do to combat this?
Yes, indeed. One of the most noteworthy parts of the report is the geopolitical importance of this. That's very valuable. Control of information and disinformation operations are a very important variable. What we have to do is differentiate Russia from the other actors. In terms of disinformation, Russia plays the most significant role, much more than the other actors. Their communications platforms, especially the one they have in Russia Today in Spanish, they have an agenda and they push these narratives. Adrian was saying something very interesting when he responded to your previous question. It's very difficult to examine what's happening on WhatsApp. And the truth is, it is true because you see the migration from the original platform where the disinformation appeared to that. When you look at processes from just a few years ago, or 2020, 2021, Facebook and Twitter, disinformation has migrated to more discrete platforms with systems that are target populations. We saw that with Parler in the US elections. It's happening with WhatsApp, with Telegram, and with other platforms as well. This has to do with the evolution of disinformation, which is continuously mutating, like the virus and the pandemic. The strategies for disinformation are evolving, and they go from what would have been paid cyber publicity to the building of narratives, and moving from Facebook and Twitter to more discrete ecosystems. These can be very lethal. It will be much more targeted, more directed and prudent. This has to do with the concept of hard and soft power. Soft power is the capacity a state has to persuade other countries without using brute force or military force. Russia is a great representative of soft power, even though it assumes this position of strong hard power, but it has a very powerful geopolitical position that was greater than what should correspond to it based on the size of its military or economy. It's because of its strategy, information and disinformation, that rest on very powerful apparatus, and we're learning more and more and understanding it increasingly better as time goes on. Thank you very much, Professor. I would invite all of you joining us today. I wanted to remind you that this event is one to launch a study that came from the DLR Lab. The Adrian Arsht Latin American Center published this report. It is on digital autocracy and Maduro's control over the information environment in Venezuela. In the report, you'll be able to read more details. We only have 10 minutes left right now. I'll ask a final question to Adrian, then we'll open it up to the public. But please, those of you joining us, click on the link to the report. Angela just posted it in the Zoom chat. You can see details about alliances between Cuba, Russia, Venezuela, and it's very interesting take on what's happening in Venezuela. So Adrian, going back to you. You are the benchmark in Venezuela. When people ask, how can I fight this? Well, how can I teach my family about what's happening? How to recognize and be aware of fake information, fake news. You are the point of contact. So this initiative that you have, What do organizations like yours need to be shored up so that you can continue on in the fight? Well, our initiative, the Fake News Hunters, were a non-traditional system for verification. We're not all journalists. There are some journalists, but we're a community of volunteers who generate synergies and discussions in virtual spaces, for example, in Telegram. That's one of the main platforms that we use. But we're not the only community like this that exists in the world, but the idea is to bring together people from civil society who do not necessarily know much about the information, but we give them the tools and techniques to defend themselves. The disinformation has to be tackled from civil society because civil society is the most impacted. There have to be more initiatives to fight disinformation. So NGOs, journalists, they can be spearheaded by these groups. And the more of these, the better. Civil society involvement is a plus. We take charge of refuting information that we have proof of. So it's not traditional fact checking, but we do provide evidence. That's the contribution we make. So any type of citizen verification, as long as it's transparent and we can show that it's honest and open, as long as there's evidence, I think that this is a good way to counter disinformation and to get to the heart of the matter, which is giving the public the tools to defend themselves against disinformation. So if we explain to people to not click on certain things and say that the reality has changed and what you're seeing on WhatsApp may come from an unreliable source and it may be disinformation. Thank you, Adrian. I'm going to take the first question from the public, Marijin Rejala, and just a little more context. She asks how Venezuelans, and just going back to what you were just saying, Adrian, how do Venezuelans who don't have access to medicine, to basic services, to food, how are they supposed to fight for their fundamental rights when their basic needs aren't even being met? And I'll add something to that. And I open this up to any of you for response. So we're in a context now where you have vaccinations, humanitarian aid can come in. There's discussion in the international community saying, what are the dangers and the challenges we have to prepare for to counter this in the digital environment in such a difficult context? Yes, I can respond. Regardless of the vulnerability experienced by Venezuelans and their difficulties in obtaining truthful information and fighting disinformation, recognizing that this is something that we've seen in Venezuela. There are so many different initiatives, small groups, family groups, where there's always someone out there who's trying to make contact with some of the anti-disinformation initiatives. So journalists, people in academia, just general public. These networks might be very small, but little by little, they're trying to counter the disinformation and people take on that information. So my main mission is that it's not having a bubble in your WhatsApp family group, but it's young people or professionals or people who are curious, who have access to social networks, who can go to the source and to fight against the disinformation and share that content in their small WhatsApp groups. Okay, so you're talking about small networks. I think that that's very important. especially in a totalitarian context like Venezuela, the way of protecting themselves and to continue to resist and fight against autocracy. You have to understand the context. That's why it's important to establish connections and networks, but not in the traditional and conventional way. It has to be a multidimensional approach. As Carla was saying, you have to use non-conventional forms of doing that. I'm left with this point you made about small networks that can be multipliers, especially in the family context. So it helps to rebuild the family fabric where people are mistrustful, they don't know who to trust. As part of information environment in Venezuela, it's very polarized, it's very complicated. So I have time for a last question. It comes from Beatriz, one of our interns. And greetings to you, Beatriz. Maduro was saying that controlling the information space and wants to increase his control over that with like the Great Firewall, much like the Chinese, limiting access that people have to information platforms. So what do you think about that? Can anyone give a quick response to that? Yes. Professor, please go ahead. Yeah, we could do an entire session on this, but indeed, we heard just recently in Davos, the head of state of China talking about the alternative model to the West. So to liberal democracy, and in the West, capitalism as the market force that is unquestionable. However, individual rights are questioned. So the alternative model, what that entails is capitalism, including capitalism of data. So this model undoubtedly is one being pursued by the Maduro regime. Nevertheless, it creates a very precarious situation for the Venezuelan state. So when the dismantling of the Venezuelan state prevents them from implementing this, even if that is their aspiration. And Daniel or Maria Virginia, we've got about a minute left for final comments. I just wanted to say something very quick in terms of the law. What generated information about this law that was brought to the Falls National Assembly was to look at Facebook. They were going to temporarily block his account because of the disinformation on coronavirus. So this is an attempt to control the social networks. And Danielle? Yes, as Professor Carmen Beatriz said, if only we had another hour to talk about this, because the external influence is one of the very important elements that's allowed Maduro to yield the control that he has right now. It's the media, it's not just the social networks. In the snapshot that we did of January, we saw the second website that was most visited was RT. So Current News RT. So Maduro and all of his regime's communications, all of these accounts have an influence throughout Latin America. We saw where there was no discussion of Venezuela when they were talking about Alphaville. And in Latin America, we saw Venezuelan accounts that were pushing the content, and that they partnered with some ambassadors' accounts in Russia as well as Venezuela. China, I'm not really sure about the influence, but You can see the technical side of this, and as was described by my fellow panelists, it's an attempt by Maduro to control the technical side, despite how precarious his ability to do that is. But they've had success, and it's part of all this. So he has been very effective. Thank you to you all for joining us. Our time is up. Thank you to our panelists. Please go read the report. It's very important. It has very relevant information. Thank you so much. We'll stay in touch, and we'll continue to try to fight disinformation from this forum and from others. Thank you.